All right, thanks everyone. I'm Kyle Ferguson. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. And I should say at the beginning that my background and my training is in philosophy. And so I thought that it's only fitting that I start with some semantics. This workshop is about pandemic resilience. So I think it's important to start with thinking about what resilience actually is. I mean, the term has its home sort of in physics and in textiles to talk about the disposition of something to sort of spring back or recoil. And the figurative use is now, I think, the dominant one. So a person or a community or a system is resilient when it's able to recover quickly or easily from or resist being affected by a misfortune. And with that sense of resilience in mind, pandemic resilience would refer to our ability to bounce back from pandemics or from pandemic threats. Borrowing this schema from the WHO, we can think about opportunities to build pandemic resilience that focus on drivers of emergence or drivers of amplification, or that inform or strengthen our mitigation and control efforts. So the question of this workshop, I think, is what role could genomic innovation play in building pandemic resilience? And to me, a promising place for genomic innovation to play that role is here. It's in the early detection, in the containment, and in the mitigation of pandemic threats. I'm going to focus even more narrowly on genomic surveillance as a tool for understanding novel pathogens, informing our efforts to control their spread, and mitigating their impacts. And my main claim in these 10 minutes here is that we've already achieved a remarkable amount of relevant genomic innovation. That is, right now, we have the tools to build greater resilience for the next pandemic, indeed, to even respond better to the present one. The most significant challenges don't have to do with innovation. They don't have to do with scientific breakthroughs or with technological innovation. Instead, I think the real challenges have to do with overcoming ethical obstacles that plague our efforts now. So those obstacles prevent us from realizing the full potential of the tools that we already have on hand. In saying this, I'm not suggesting that we don't pursue further genomic innovation. Instead, it's more a matter of calling out the more banal moral failures, familiar flaws in our values and our commitments, and also to offer a warning that the same obstacles might plague future innovations and their applications. So genomic surveillance is simply a process of decoding genes to learn more about a pathogen. Doing this helps us to understand, for example, a virus, to monitor how its genome changes over time and understand how these changes affect the virus's traits, including how it spreads and affects those it infects. By decoding a pathogen's genome, we can learn how it works and how to fight it. In the context of COVID-19, this has been incredibly useful. Genomic surveillance has played vital roles in our pandemic response. So 2 days after they identified the virus, researchers in China posted its genetic sequence to a public database. And only a few weeks later, vaccine candidates were identified, diagnostic tests were developed. This was crucial information for developing therapeutics and for tracking the spread. Later, it helped predict how patients' immune systems would respond to infection, which can inform triage. And more recently, just 72 hours after discovery in Botswana and South Africa, WHO named Omicron variant a variant of concern. So despite these enormous successes, things could have been significantly better, and not for lack of genomic innovation, but for value failures and practical commitment failures. So these ethical obstacles we see at work in the current pandemic. I'll just pick three for the discussion. I think these are global inequality, undervaluing and underinvestment in public health, and threats to sharing and cooperation. With respect to global inequality, if we take a look at Africa, there's a recent paper that looked at 1 year of sequencing in the COVID-19 pandemic on the continent. So approximately one sequence per 300 reported cases. That's a very low rate of sequencing. And half of those were from one country alone, South Africa. There was inconsistent sampling across the year. Patchy data made it hard to track the impact of the virus in Africa. Case numbers were underreported, and there was very little sequencing. I don't think that genomic innovation or a lack of it was the problem. The problem was not enough access to equipment, poor infrastructure. The solutions have to do with addressing those problems. And most importantly, you need to have capacity building in staff in these countries. So those solutions require real solidarity, sort of moving beyond the rhetoric of solidarity and living according to it. As far as the second ethics challenge, in the US, we lack the infrastructure to scale up genomic surveillance. State public health departments are far behind academic and commercial labs, and states are only sequencing less than 2% of their positive samples. We need more investment in equipment and personnel in public health structures. That's crucial for coordinating and making use of that knowledge. The UK provides a good model for how to do this. They not only had the NHS test and trace system in place, but they were able to use the information from the labs. They could match it to electronic health records in the NHS system and thereby know what the genomic information means in clinical and public health spheres. We ought to invest in those kinds of systems here, but public health is increasingly politicized in the US, and our acute care model and lack of universal coverage, I think, undermines the value of genomics in this country. We need a more public spirit to animate investment in and commitment to public health infrastructure. The third challenge consists of threats to sharing and cooperation.
2 minutes.
We disincentivize cooperation when we close borders and restrict travel to and from countries that provide early warnings. That leads to social and economic harms. We're seeing that play out in real time today. So we need to find ways to nurture transparency, incentivize sharing, and show gratitude and reciprocity for early warnings. Two other threats that I'll skip for the sake of time. One has to do with specious claims to viral sovereignty and another to intellectual property. Now, a One Health approach, I think, kind of shifts the focus over to anticipation and early detection. And the role of genomics there and genomic innovation, I think, would be with its role in ecosystem surveillance and its role potentially in gene editing for animal and ecological health. So there's sort of a pivot away from surveillance of a pathogen in human populations and towards surveillance and maybe even intervention in ecosystems. So Bob Dylan said, you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. You don't need genomic innovation to know about and to stop a lot of the drivers of zoonotic disease threats. Many of the drivers are readily perceivable and within our power, independent of genomic innovation. But we can't maintain business as usual and expect genomic innovation to do all the work. The analogy here is when people talk about geoengineering as mitigation deterrence, I worry about the same kind of thing with talking about genomic innovation. I'll skip this and conclude by saying that the three obstacles that I mentioned, those aren't going to simply disappear by pivoting to ecosystem surveillance and gene editing. A sincere commitment to a One Health approach might help to overcome them. But I worry that One Health might just become empty rhetoric, where it's divorced from its defining theoretical and practical commitments. So there are potential roles for genomic innovation in the next pandemic. But even if no innovation occurs between now and then, we can build greater pandemic resilience with present tools if, but only if, we have the right values and practical commitments. The same ethical obstacles that we see with genomic surveillance now will impose severe limits even when we adopt a One Health perspective. Thank you.